Page 70, chapter 16, nearing the latter part of the chapter. Speaking about, what are we speaking about? Well, we said that there are two key elements that the Beinoni has to know. Two secrets of being a Beinoni, right? What are the secrets of the Beinoni? Well, the one thing that we said is that it's really, really important for a person to understand that the mind has to rule the heart. And that's part of the nature of a human being. That's how Hashem made us. That's the gift that He gave us, that we should have this ability. And then the second thing, which is what we're focused on now, is that even if you are not in love with Hashem in the most passionate, overflowing way, you can still get your head right. And when you do that, and you have the right values, it helps. So I know I keep going back to the example, but that's similar to the person who acknowledges the value of good manners, even if they don't feel that it's important. So they do it because they acknowledge that it's valuable. Or the person who acknowledges the value of flowers before Shabbos, even though they don't feel what flowers are, what they do and why they're worth anything. But the fact is you do it because you acknowledge the value. So the same kind of thing can happen to us spiritually. That even if we don't have this gushing, passionate love towards Hashem, which would be ideal, and that would be the highest state that a person could get to, is even if we don't have that, at the very least, we can get it clear in our heads that this is something worth loving, this is something worth being passionate about, this is something worth valuing. And then that will affect us, that will help us to actually be able to do what it is that we're supposed to do. Now, the last time we came across an expression, this is a very useful expression, it's on page 70, about almost halfway down the page, almost exactly halfway down the page, we came across the concept of wings. Remember that? This is like spiritual Red Bull. So what gives your mitzvahs wings? That's what we spoke about last time. And we said that the bird can survive without its wings. It's not an ideal way to live. It's maybe more susceptible to predators. Maybe it can't move as much as it should. Maybe it'll be difficult to find food. But technically it could survive in the same way as a human being who has, let's say, a human being is a double amputee, but they could still live. It's far from ideal, but they could still live. So in the bird's experience, the wings are those limbs, like in the human experience, arms and legs would be. So they're very important and they're very valuable, but they're not life-sustaining. And so if they're not there, the person, or in this case the bird, could survive. And it's the same kind of thing when it comes to us doing what Hashem wants. There is the body of what we have to do, the requirements, the mitzvahs. And we have a nice long list, especially at this time of the year. If you really want to cash in on mitzvahs, this is your time. Because between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot, there are so many mitzvahs that you could do that are unusual besides the regular mitzvahs. They can really cash in. Now the body, the quantum of all of those mitzvahs is not dependent on what kind of sentiment you have, how much you feel, how passionate you are. That's not important. It's not important to doing the mitzvah. You do the mitzvah. Nobody's going to come along and test you. Did you do the mitzvah with the right intentions? Did you do the mitzvah with as much passion as you should? It's nobody's business. You do the mitzvah. You show up. You do the mitzvah. You check the box. All good. But for your own experience and your own degree of connection to Hashem, well, that's going to make a big difference if you feel passion or at least acknowledge the value of the passion, etc. So those are the wings. Now, usually, in most conversations in Hasidic works, if we describe wings of the mitzvahs or wings of the soul, we're talking about a real, tangible love towards Hashem or a real, tangible fear and awe of Hashem. That's not what we're talking about over here. And that's why this was such a big surprise to us, because we discovered that it's actually possible that all the person has is just like in their mind. They're conscious of the fact that this is something that is important and valuable and worth being passionate about, whatever. And that in itself is already going to give the person wings. That's kind of where we left off. And it's still something which I think is a little bit unclear. Like, how does this technology work? What exactly is happening? And by the way, part of the question is, where are you supposed to fly to? It's all very well to say you've got to have wings, but if you don't, like, what do I need to have wings for? Do the mitzvah.
It's a whole feeling. It's a whole...
Okay, but wings imply that you're flying. Flying where?
You know, when people on drugs, they say they're flying.
Okay, but we don't want to have that kind of an experience. We certainly don't want to compare ourselves to somebody who's tripping. You know, if we're talking about flying, it must be because there's some value to flying, and the implication of flying is that you're above ground, that you're higher than all the terrestrial beings who are kind of stuck on the ground. So where exactly are we looking to fly when we do a mitzvah? I can understand if you tell me that the mitzvah is supposed to fly. That I get it. But where exactly are we supposed to fly? What, to heaven? Is that how we live? That every time we do a mitzvah, we fly up to heaven? So we need to understand what exactly are we talking about over here. These are the things we have to start to clarify. What does it mean to have wings? What does it mean to fly? Where are we trying to fly to? How do the wings operate differently? Okay? And while we're about this...
When we received the Torah, what wasn't it that the soul went up, they left their bodies?
Yeah, but that doesn't happen to us when we do a mitzvah. Nobody's going to suggest that when we do a mitzvah, we have that kind of radical experience that they had at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was such a radical experience that the neshama flew out of the body. And nobody's going to suggest to us that the goal of mitzvahs is to fly out of our bodies. That's for sure not the goal. In fact, to the contrary. There's criticism of those people who followed a path where they were trying to eject their souls out of their body. It's not seen as a positive thing. So that's definitely not what we're trying to achieve up here. So the question is, what are we trying to achieve? And while we're about it, we're going to talk about one of the most contentious issues that people have in their spiritual development, and that is good intentions, right? How people often say, well, I had good intentions, and because I had good intentions, I should at least get some credit for having tried, for having intended to do the right thing, even if it didn't really work out that way. And that's part of what we're going to examine in this particular conversation, is we're going to understand that the notion of good intentions has a radically different interpretation when you look at it through the lens of the Torah. Okay, so there's quite a lot of stuff for us to explore and to discuss and to unpack over here this evening. So where we're going to start is we're going to start with something we already read last week. So if you look on the screen, it's the first line that's on the screen. If you're looking in the book, then it is just shy of halfway down the page. If you see partway down the page, you'll see there's a set of brackets. So if you go 2 lines up from those brackets to the second last word on that line, that's where we are. So, okay, so we didn't really get to unpack this fully last time, so here's our opportunity to do so. What did we say? We said that when a person has what we've called tavuna, and we identified that tavuna is not the same as bina. Bina is a very developed, mature, robust intellectual appreciation of something, whereas tavuna is kind of a lower grade understanding of something, where it's not something that's become so compelling to me and now it's going to touch me in my heart. Because the principle is that when you really, really get something in a very meaningful, real way, then it's going to affect you. So if you truly understand something, you're going to have an emotional response to it. You're going to have a passion, you're going to have an excitement, you're going to have an investment. Here, when we're talking about tavuna, we're saying there is an almost second-hand type of connection. It's like, I'm aware of the fact that this is meaningful. I get it. I acknowledge it in my head. And that's not necessarily going to translate into this fiery passion, because so whatever, I get it. It's like when a person says to you, yes, I hear what you have to say. Okay, I hear what you have to say. It doesn't mean necessarily that I buy what you have to say. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to react to what you have to say. Okay, fine, I hear it. That's that's your opinion. That would be kind of this tavuna experience, where a person sits down, spends some time, learns about Hashem, meditates on Hashem's greatness to the extent that it becomes something that you could just use it as a tool, as a catalyst for behaving a little bit better. So what happens when a person does that? 3 things: moichin, chayos, and gadfin. He's identifying 3 things that happen over here. Moichin is brains, that's the direct translation. But really what we mean when we say moichin, we mean the intellect. Chayos is vitality, life, enthusiasm. And gadfin are wings, which, as promised, is a big part of what we're going to be speaking about over here today, is the concept of wings. So what are we suggesting over here? We're suggesting the first thing that happens is moichin. First thing that happens is that the brain actually buys into this concept, into Hashem's greatness, into the importance of mitzvahs. That's very helpful for us, because if our brain plugs into something, it's going to lead us in that direction, right? If a person's brain is not engaged, it's incredibly unlikely that they'll have any meaningful connection with something. So you think of many of the activities that we do, the brain is not necessarily engaged in any deep, meaningful way for us to do those activities. Whatever it is, driving, eating, often even conversing. Very often people have conversations. There's no deep brain engagement. Yeah, hello, how are you? Fine, thanks, and you? What's happening? Nothing much. And by you? Nothing really. Same, da-da-da. Right? Those kinds of experiences are not moichin. There's no intellect. There's no value of the intellect. Whereas here, we're talking about somebody who's trying their best. They're trying to understand. And as you'll see a little bit later in the chapter, this is very much about a person who's trying. We're not excusing somebody who hasn't invested and we say, oh, well, poor me, what do you want? I don't understand. I don't have a deep appreciation of Hashem. Well, okay, did you try? Here we're talking about somebody who's trying, who's actually doing the learning and trying to contemplate, but for whatever reason, they're unable to do it in a proper way because either they are not intellectually, powerful enough, or because maybe there's a lot of distraction, or perhaps because the concepts are too abstract, whatever the reason is, but they're trying. So there's moichin, there's an intellectual process that's happening. Now, anytime that there is a real intellectual process, there will be chayos, there will be enthusiasm. In fact, I don't know if you have a similar experience, but I would assume you do. Often, we are supposed to be learning something, possibly because we made a commitment that we were going to learn it, or because somebody badgered us and we said, okay, fine, I'll come along, I'll come to the shiur, that kind of thing. We drag ourselves out of bed or wherever we drag ourselves out of in order to come to the shiur. And when we arrive, very often we think, oh, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And by the way, if you think that's bad, imagine if this person who's giving the shiur who feels that way. Yeah? That's a real problem. That's a real problem. Often people apologize, say to rabbis, I'm terribly sorry, I fell asleep while you were speaking. That's not so bad. If the rabbi falls asleep, they've got a serious problem, right? So often we arrive and we're depleted. It's the end of the day. This is not the best time to sit down and learn. Once upon a time when there was an agricultural society, so told people come in the evening and have say, okay, fine. They didn't wring themselves out in the same way as we do. We get up, we run at 100 miles an hour the whole day long. You come over here, it's like, oh my gosh, okay, but I said I'm going to do it, so we sit here and we're kind of nodding off and the mind is distracted, whatever. You're not going to have much passion. But as the shiur progresses, sometimes what happens to us is we find it really stimulating. And we even use that word in English. We say that this learning or this intellectual process is stimulating. And you could find yourself energized, getting a second wind, suddenly becoming very animated, even though just not long before you were like, oh my gosh, I'm schlepping. So moichin relates to chayas. When there is a meaningful intellectual engagement, it does give you energy. That's how it is. That's how humans are. I mean, maybe with an exception. Maybe there's certain people who are intellectually challenged. That's not going to work. Okay, fine. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the average person. The average person, we underestimate the power of the mind. Not the power of the mind to sit here and have, some kind of focused intention and, I don't know, people who want to do things like, start levitating and doing telekinesis and all that. I'm not talking about that.
No, I never levitate. Let's just get
okay, good. Baruch Hashem. Right? So what I mean by the power of the mind is we underestimate the power of a stimulated mind and how much value it brings to a person. And it's probably one of the great challenges of living in the modern age, because so many people are doing things that do the opposite of stimulating the mind for hours at a time. I once read a piece of research that indicated, this blew my mind, that when a person watches TV, there is less brain activity than when they sleep. It's a mind-blowing thought, right?
It is, yeah.
And that was, I read this at least a decade ago. So that was before the whole onslaught of small devices and social media. So the amount of people who are doing the opposite of intellectual stimulation in our world, it's no surprise that there are so many useful idiots running around standing up for causes that are completely meaningless because they have been deliberately dumbed down. Now, change that scenario, and come sit around the table in a shiur. It's a completely opposite, not different, opposite experience. Now you're being challenged. Now you've got to think. These are concepts that are not part of the daily experience. There's abstraction, there's debate, there are layers of understanding, whatever. You will come to life. And that's what, with all due respect to the people who watch online, it's not the same. It's not the same as having that personal engagement, but at least it's intellectual. At least you're stimulating your mind. Where there is moichin, there is chayos. If you want to see the demise of a society, strip them away of intellectual challenge, and that society will deplete and will disappear. You want to grow a society? You want to become a superpower nation? Feed the intellect. I don't mean brainwash. Feed the intellect. Encourage thinking and exploration and innovation and debate, and then you'll get chayos. Moichin equals chayos.
Can I ask a question? Because okay, so for me, like the intellectual shiurim now, to me is very much food for the soul, because overthinking or whatever the talk can be on a negative way as well. You can go to something that is intellectual that's going to pull you down.
So let's be clear. I think you make a very important point. Let's be clear that people use academia as a tool or even a weapon. That is not intellectual engagement. That is intellectual assault.
Okay.
So we could do that. We could sit people down in a lecture hall and tell them that here is Professor so-and-so, who's the great expert on anthropology, who's going to now tell you what's wrong with you because you're a white male or whatever the case is. That is an intellectual assault. Intellectual stimulation and engagement is you sit around and you have conversation and you explore concepts that are outside of your agenda. That's key, because remember, intellect is always exploring the objective truth of things. That's real intellect. Whereas selling your academic version of your bias, that is not intellect. It's really important to distinguish that between academics and intellect. They're not synonymous. So it's a very important point that you raised. So moichin equals chayos. Why? Because if I'm tantalizing myself, if I'm stimulating my brain with something that's bigger than myself, that's deeper than my experience, that's going to bring me to life. Think of it this way, very simple way to think of it. You could have a person who is, and again, with all due respect to people in this field, a person who's an auditor. Okay? So, all right, you've got to go in there. You've got to use your brain at the end of the day. You've got to use your brain to audit this particular company. Is it something which is stimulating? Is it? No, absolutely not. Take that and compare it to the person who's working in a scientific laboratory and doing experiments. What an incredibly exciting thing to do. No, not every experiment is exciting. And many, many times things just don't pan out as expected and you're repeating the same thing with minor tweaks and variations. And it gets tedious. I get that, obviously. But there is the promise of excitement at some point, because if you're able to find that your experiment either produced a result you expected, which is great, or it produced a result that you didn't expect, which is even better, there's an excitement in that. But what's going to happen at the end of the audit? You're going to say, guess what? We actually found that your company is compliant. Shkoyach. You know, where's... So
sometimes I've found thieves.
Yes, okay.
It's exciting.
Fine, fair enough. So if you're doing a forensic audit... Right? If you're doing a forensic audit, that's going to be exciting. But the point I'm making is that moichin equals chayos. If you engage the mind, you bring people to life. And we owe it. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our families. We owe it to our children. We owe it to the educational system. This business of taking kids, plonking them down in chairs and saying, now you sit here and repeat after me. That's not moichin. It's not engaging. It's not exciting the intellect. So don't expect chayas. Don't expect that these kids are going to say, wow, we love school, we love education, we love whatever it is that you're teaching us. It doesn't work that way. So anyhow, coming back to this, enough of the political rant, but the point is, what's relevant to us in our lives, in our spiritual development, where there is moichin, there will be chayas. If I spend time thinking about, meditating on, learning about Hashem's greatness, then I have a chance that I'll be excited about God. If I never do that, if all I'm ever doing is reading the Parsha of the week with somebody's download email commentary that I read, okay, thank you very much, yeah, here's a nice little thought, how am I supposed to be excited about God? I'm not even thinking about God. So what we want is we want to have a scenario where people are thinking about God, thinking deeply about God, challenging themselves, thinking about their soul, thinking about purpose, thinking about what the world is about, all of the kind of thought process, the moichin that Torah wants us to have. In this chapter, we're talking specifically about thinking about Hashem and the value of the relationship I can forge with Hashem through Torah mitzvahs. That's the main thing we're talking about over here. So when there's moichin, there's chayos. Where I have some kind of deep, meaningful, intellectual experience, I will be alive. Which, by the way, last little rant on this piece, you get a lot of people in today's world, in the Jewish world, who just want to do the happy clappy version. Let's get everybody together. We'll make it fun. We'll put out sushi. We'll sing a nice tune. It's going to be very exciting. And we hope that that's somehow going to engage people in their Judaism. And then we cry, what happened? How come our children are disengaged and they're not interested and they're assimilating, whatever the case is? Because we don't go back to the bottom line of what it is to be Jewish, which is what? The people of the book. The people of Torah. Well, it's not the people of the book. We're the people of the intellect, the people of the understanding, because a lot of our Torah is not in the book. A lot of our Torah is Baal Peh, is oral tradition. But the fact is, we're the people of debate, of querying, of investigation, of meditation, of using the mind as a tool to access the soul. And if we're not going to offer that to people, we're going to offer them some kind of an inauthentic version of Judaism. What do you expect is going to happen? How can they have chayus? How can they be alive? So he's telling us very valuable information over here for our own stimulation and for the perpetuity of Judaism. And then when you do that, then it will give a person wings that they should be able to take their mitzvahs and let them fly upwards. Now he's used that word, upwards. We're looking to take the mitzvah and to elevate it. Now we don't at this point yet know what that means to elevate it, and we'll still talk about it. And he says, so this is all stuff we learned already last time. That what's going to happen, that when a person engages their mind and meditates and contemplates Hashem's greatness and the greatness and value of having a relationship with Hashem, and that the means of that relationship is through Torah and mitzvahs, so it's as if the person actually has the passion. So we can call it virtual passion. It's an interesting thing. I don't know if you've ever experienced it. Have you ever experienced what they call the phantom cell phone syndrome? Have you ever had it? It's where you feel that something's buzzing in your pocket, but it's actually not your phone. That's a real thing. It's a real experience people have. So there's no phone in the pocket, but they still get the sensation as if there's a buzzing. Virtual experiences can be very real. Right? You ever seen that experiment where they put the person's hand in front of a mirror? And then they use the hammer, right? The hammer on the other side. And it's not actually hitting the hand, and the person actually feels the pain. Virtual experiences can be very compelling. They can be very real, even though they are virtual. That's what he's telling us over here. That when a person invests in their experience of learning about Hashem's greatness, etc., so you might not have the tzaddik level, full-blown passion of relationship with Hashem, but the virtual experience is compelling. And that's something I don't feel we talk about this enough, because we so often live, and I don't know why this is and who perpetuates it, but we so often live with this all or nothing view of Judaism. Okay, if you're not a tzaddik, well then, what are you really worth anyway? And here he's telling us something incredibly powerful. You're going to be light years away from a tzaddik, and you could still have a virtual experience of what the tzaddik is having, and it will be compelling. There'll be something that will give you wings, that will literally elevate your entire experience of Judaism. This is incredibly, I would say helpful, but I would say it's encouraging. It's encouraging information. Okay, in brackets. If a person was having the true experience, then what they would have is they'd actually have a yearning in their heart, and they'd have a desire, they'd have almost a compulsion in their heart. And they'd have a soul that thirsts for a connection to Hashem, because of the fiery love inside their heart, as he already mentioned much earlier in Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe spoke, and it's quite logical, about the idea that thirst is associated with heat, obviously, right? If the hotter it is, the easier it is to get thirsty. So conceptually, where a person has love towards Hashem, love is always comparable to fire, because the passion and fire, we don't have to explain it. It's a very clear connection. Wherever there's passion, there will be a thirst. There'll be a yearning. I've got to get more. I've got to get more. Like the person who's in love, they can't get enough of the person they're in love with. Like they'll stay up till all hours talking, and they'll go to the other ends of the earth to see them, or whatever the case, because there's a thirst. And I have to somehow satisfy that thirst. So it's the same thing in our relationship with Hashem, that if a person was really advanced, like the tzaddik would be, and that has this experience of of this real passion and love towards Hashem, it's become almost like an insatiable thirst. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the person who's having the virtual version. So here's the point that we're going to focus on today. Hoyel. or tfuna zoy shebemoicha v'talumos liboy, hi hamaviasoi lasik bohem. See, the value over here is, we're talking about somebody who invests, spends time, learns, meditates, etc. And as a result of that, reaches the point we're calling tavuna. Tavuna is like, it's now an axiom in my life that this is worthwhile. So let's step out of this for a second and see an example.
Now, which is understanding.
Yes, it's related to that, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's use this example. What happens? Shame, I was at somebody's house today. Somebody's sitting shiva, and there was a phone number that kept phoning the late father's phone. And then, they didn't know who it was, and maybe they should answer because maybe it's somebody who's trying to get hold of him, doesn't know that he's passed away, whatever. So eventually they answer the phone, and I'm sure you've already guessed. It was somebody phoning to offer insurance policies. Yeah. So that's like particularly ill-timed, right? In any event. So I'm thinking about it. I don't know what you do when you get these phone calls.
I say to them, don't waste
or maybe you have Truecaller or whatever it is and you don't answer in the first place. But let's say you answer. And it's somebody who's trying to sell you a product. Whatever the product is. Might be a type of insurance or whatever it is. The chance, sometimes I feel so bad for these people because the chances that anybody's going to give them the time of day is, I don't know, it must be near zero. That's a terrible job, right? Terrible job. You're phoning, everybody's rude and everybody's impatient and like, how did you get my number and leave me alone and whatever, all that kind of stuff. Eventually they get somebody who's actually willing to listen. So we're going to pretend for a moment that we're that person who's willing to listen because we know that we're not, but let's just pretend we are. Now we're listening to this person and they explain to us the value of the particular product that they're selling. Let's just call it some kind of an insurance product that they're selling. And they explain to us the value and they explain that the premium is not particularly high. And let's be honest, what's 95 Rand a month or whatever their particular sales pitch is? And we get to the point where we say, you know what you've said makes sense. Actually does make sense. The amount of investment it's going to cost me and the potential protection it's going to give me actually makes sense. Go ahead, sign me up. How likely is it that we're going to then put down the phone and phone all our friends and tell them, you'll never believe this amazing deal that I just got, and you should do the same? What are the chances?
0.
Beyond 0, right? So that tells you something interesting. That tells you that it is possible to have, now we're going to apply the word, to have tavuna, which is the intellectual acknowledgement that something has value without having any passion whatsoever. And my behavior is now going to respond to this acknowledgement. So because I acknowledge that it's worthwhile, that's why I'm actually going to start paying money and buy this particular policy. And it now becomes part of my life and something that I actually value, and still there's no passion. That's what we're talking about over here, right? We're talking about tavuna. This is a person who's come to the point where, of course, there's no salesperson knocking on the door saying, listen, would you like me to sell you a Bible and speak about God? We're not talking about that. This is somebody who goes on their own journey and spends their own time exploring and learning and deepening their experience, etc. And then they reach the point of tavuna, which is to say, got it. I see the value. I'm ready to buy in. I'm ready to do the things that are required as part of this program because I can see the benefits of that program. 100%. That's called tavuna. And they could still do that without passion. And the indicator of when a person has passion about something is when they actually can't help themselves but share it. That's what happens when you have passion. The most annoying people in the world are people with passion because they don't stop every single time you talk to them. That's what they're talking about. And they're hacking, and they found a new detail, and they're telling you, and whatever. And everybody's got to do what they do because they're passionate. So it's a fascinating thought. We don't necessarily stop to analyze this, but in human experience, it's quite common that a person could have an intellectual acknowledgement and buy-in to a concept without reaching the point of passion. In this case, what we're talking about here is exactly that. Somebody's achieved the level of tavuna, But thanks to that level of tavuna, thanks to the fact that they've intellectually acknowledged the value, they are now going to change their behavior. And ultimately, let's be honest, the most important thing is behavior. You can have all the theory in the world, all the knowledge in the world, all the ideals in the world, but until it translates into behavior, it's actually worth nothing. And once it translates into behavior, we're not so bothered anymore by what got you there. The fact is you're doing what's right. So that's what we're saying over here. This tavuna becomes the wings in this person's experience, because this tavuna, this intellectual acknowledgement, is what's got them to actually start behaving differently, to actually move in a healthy direction spiritually, thanks to this tavuna. So listen to what he says next. Because here we're describing a scenario where if this person had not given time and contemplation to this concept, and therefore they had never reached the point of tavuna, of acknowledgement, then lo haya oisek bohem klal. Then the person would never have engaged in this behavior. Exactly like me with the telemarketer. If I hadn't given them the time of day, if I hadn't listened to their pitch, if I hadn't acknowledged the value of what they're pitching, there's no way I would have bought the policy. It's exactly the same thing. If I hadn't given Hashem the time of day, if I hadn't researched and learnt and then contemplated about what I've learnt, I wouldn't have had this acknowledgement that the single most valuable thing I could do in my life is a mitzvah, and I wouldn't be doing the mitzvahs.
But isn't the wings then going forward rather than
We're still going to get to the
up?
wings. We're still going to get to the wings. But right now what we're showing is the link between the tavuna acknowledgement and this newfound behavior. Now the question is this. What's the alternative? What would a person have been doing if they didn't have this realization? And this is so relatable, it's so practical. Because if we think about ourselves, how did any of us get to where we are in our Judaism? There had to be points along the way where we acknowledge, this is meaningful, or this is important, or this is what I should be doing as a Jewish person. And then we engaged with it. Nothing happens by accident. Nothing happens automatically. There was some level of consciousness. So what would we be doing? What's the alternative? If a person is not prioritizing mitzvahs and not prioritizing what Hashem wants, so what are they doing instead? Are they criminals?
No.
No.
Not necessarily.
No, of course. You know how often people say, Rabbi, I may not be frum, but I'm a good person. Okay. So you're not a criminal just because you're not doing these things that are the experience and the requirements of the term. Okay, so you're not a criminal. So what's a person doing all day?
Not using their brains?
They might be using their brains. They might be incredibly intellectual people. There might be people who are doing amazing things. They could be innovating. They could be philosophizing. They could be using their brains. So what are they doing? Look what he says. Ela v'tzorchei gufoi levad. If a person does not have this acknowledgement of the value of a relationship with Hashem and therefore Torah and mitzvahs, then that person is going to spend all of their time and energy only invested in their personal physical needs.
The
Why?
animalistic soul.
Yeah, because that's people. That's how we're designed. We're designed to be self-interested, to be self-preserving, to be successful. All these wonderful things which essentially mean prioritizing my physical needs. That's what we're going to do. Now, in the brackets next, he's going to say something fascinating. Now, this statement that the Alter Rebbe is about to make is something that needs to be shared with a lot of, saying, from people. If you hang around the Tanya share long enough, you'll know that I'm not a fan of the term from. But we'll just borrow it for now, right? From people. Because I have absolutely no idea what from is supposed to mean. As far as I'm concerned, from basically means my standard of Judaism. If you're doing more than me, you're a Meshuggah. And if you're doing less than me, you're a secular good for nothing.
Where does the word from come from?
I don't know.
I suppose some Yiddish word.
Yeah. Okay? In Afrikaans, we say it as well. Frum. It means the same thing. Like, whatever, it's dedicated. But this line has to be shared far and wide in the Frum community. Because here the Alter Rebbe says, you might have somebody who is masmid b'tivoy. You might have somebody who, just by nature, is a very academic person, is a very assiduous person. That's what they like. They like to sit and learn. Not disciplined, intellectually stimulated. They like to sit and learn. That's what they enjoy. That's what they do. So this person is going to say, I don't need the whole Tavuna experience to get me to learn, because I learn. That's just who I am. So listen to what he says. If you think that there is somebody who by nature is a learner, that's probably true. And it's equally true that they love themselves by nature as well. And if you had to put the two on the scale, anybody who's just following their nature, even if they have a good nature, even if they have a helpful nature, even if they have a nature that is inclined to Torah learning, if you had to take the nature I have to learn and the nature I have to be self-interested, the self-interested nature will always win. So if I'm going to rely on my natural makeup and think that I'm spiritually on point because I'm naturally inclined in a particular way, that is a gamble that I will probably lose every time. Because when you're dealing with human nature, the human nature for self-interest, the human nature for physical pleasure is a stronger human nature than the human nature for study. Therefore, if a person really wants to be focused, and a person really wants to do what Hashem wants, and a person really wants to move forward spiritually, they can't rely on even the best natural makeup that they potentially have. They've got to invest in Tavuna. They've got to invest in getting their head right. And with that, he's going to take us into a completely radical interpretation of a very well-known line from the Talmud. This principle that we've just discussed over the last few weeks, which is that if I apply my mind and I learn about Hashem and I contemplate Hashem's greatness, it will affect my Judaism in a completely different way. That was alluded to by our sages, Be'omram, when they made the following statement. What's the statement? I'm going to read it. Then I'm going to translate it with the conventional translation, which is exactly what the Alter Rebbe wants to get away from. Machshava toiva, a good thought. This is a statement straight out of the Talmud. Machshava toiva, a good thought. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzarfa lemaise. Hashem links it to deed. You know how most people understand that statement? Let's think about it. How do you understand that statement? A good thought, Hashem attaches it or links it or connects it, whichever word you want to use, to deed. What do you think that means?
And if you think of something good, you're going to do good.
Okay. Any other thoughts? This line from the Gemara is the most frequently quoted line that people use to justify having good intentions. Machshava toiva, I had good intentions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzarfa lemaise. Hashem will link my good intentions to an action. What does that mean? So there are a number of sages in the Gemara who discuss what this line is and what it's supposed to mean and what the message is. One of the sages is Rav Asi, who's a very respected sage in the very latter part of the Talmudic era. Rav Asi says it means this. Let's say that you had good intentions. For example, you had good intentions to come to the Tanya Shir. But then something happened that was out of your control. So your intention was to come to the Tanya Shir, but then you got a burst tire on the way here. And now you had to sit on the side of the road and get somebody to help you and start your, change your tire and the whole thing. So you did not get to the Shir. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzarfa lemaisa. Rav Asi says, you know what Hashem's going to do now? Hashem's going to say, look, you tried. You had good intentions. So because of circumstances beyond your control, you were unable to fulfill those good intentions, Hashem says, I'll consider it as if you did it. That's how most people translate it. As you're about to see, the Alter Rebbe says that does not seem to be the right translation. Why? So let's read. He says, really what the Gemara should have said to convey that principle, should have used these words. Maile olav hakasuv ke'ilu asa'a. Now that's an expression which is very common in Talmudic language. Maile olav hakasuv. That means that the Torah considers it as if. Maile olav hakasuv ke'ilu asa'a. That would have been the right language to say, listen, if you had the good intention to do a mitzvah, but for reasons beyond your control, you were unable to do the mitzvah, Hashem will consider it as if you did it. Which of course sounds great and sounds very magnanimous, and we hope that that's how Hashem is going to treat us, etc. But that's not what the Gemara said. The Gemara did not use that expression. It did not use the conventional, it's considered like. Instead it said, Hashem links it to. Machshava toiva HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'maaseh. Here, the Alter Rebbe totally revolutionizes this line. And he says like this. Machshava tova, a good thought, is not a good intention. Machshava tova means that I did the good intellectual process called tevuna. That's the real meaning of Machshava tova. I didn't just go about my Judaism in some superficial, disembodied way. I spent time and I learned. And I meditated on what I learned. And I came to appreciate the value of the mitzvahs that I'm doing. And I came to appreciate the greatness of the God for whom I'm doing these mitzvahs. And I came to appreciate how the mitzvah is going to create a bond between me and Hashem. That's the machshava toiva. That's the good thought process I went through. Unfortunately for me, I'm not at that level that I could go so deep that it will translate into tangible passion. But at least I had a good thought process. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzarfa l'maaseh. Hashem will then take that good thought process and link it to the action that I'm going to do, because now I'm going to behave in a particular way based on what I thought about, based on that thought process, based on that analysis, based on that contemplation. Now I'm going to behave in a particular way. Hashem is going to plug that thought process into the action, so the action will become another level of action. Not just doing stuff, but doing stuff with wings. Because I invested, because I learned, because I contemplated, Hashem will take the value of that intellectual process and use it to embellish and uplift and upgrade the action I'm about to do. So two people will be sitting side by side. They'll both do the identical action. It will look the same. It will sound the same. As far as we're concerned, as external observers, there is no difference between the two people. This person is wrapping tefillin around his arm, and this person is wrapping tefillin around his arm. And this person is getting one credit for a mitzvah, and that person is getting one credit for a mitzvah. But because out of the two people, one of them had already invested time and energy in learning and in contemplating, he is going to be boosted that his action will actually rise in a way that the other person's action doesn't. So how many mitzvahs do you get? One mitzvah each. How much spiritual impact is there in that mitzvah? Completely different, because Hashem will turbo boost the behavior of the person who spent time learning and contemplating his greatness. Now, we haven't yet got into why that is called wings, and why it's specifically an upward movement, and where it's moving up to. That we will still, please God, continue in the next piece.